Good evening, and welcome to my Philosophy 3127 mind map number 3, Concepts of Truth. So, in general, today I'd like to talk about the three sources that we've been giving: Blumenberg's paradigms on a metaphorology, Spengler's decline of the West, and Heidegger's the question concerning technology. Please forgive me. So today, let's begin with Blumenberg's paradigms. So, in my opinion, from my reading of the source, his main thesis is: how does the pursuit or treatment of truth affect human history, and how is that represented through metaphor? So he kind of begins by looking at the scientific approach, which is a concept that was born during the 17th century by Francis Bacon, where truth was discovered through a very aggressive, very disciplined interrogative approach, where where someone is expected to interrogate nature, to discover experiments, and to find general a general observation or general trend that is based off of observations from reality. Uh, and from that, he states a few basic philosophies that come from the Greek times. This idea of religion, which which is where truth is measured out to supply human happiness and tastes, which means that truth is not complete and absolute in this case, versus Stoicism, where truth is where the discovery of truth comes from absolute irrevocable proof and a completely rigorous defense. So these ideas later developed, following Greek times, into this general view that there was an objective truth, which would forcibly reflect itself upon observers. This idea that truth forces itself into the forefront. That was something that was very critical to the development of systems of justice during the Middle Ages and beyond. However, as we get more into modern thought, he found that truth is kind of thought of in a different way. This idea of the force of truth was argued by thinkers like Nietzsche and Hume, to be not that this force is not intrinsic to truth, but simply intrinsic to an idea, whatever idea forces itself to the front of someone's mind. This appears to be the final idea that Blumenberg converges on in his work. Next, let's talk about Spengler's Decline of the West. So he generally argues about the question: can nature be reduced to pure mathematics and physics, or is there something beyond mathematics and physics? So his general argument is that every presupposition, whether that be scientific or religious, surrounding the nature of reality, depends on personal bias. So scientific data is processed by human scientists, and many times throughout history, the personal biases of those human scientists affect how that data becomes interpreted and eventually turns into scientific theory. In a way, and in fact, he very directly argues that makes science a religion, a discipline where a general dogma, general statements of thought are based more off of human interpretation. Somewhat like Blumenberg's argument that a religious truth is based off of this idea of human happiness and tastes, rather than any kind of truly objective way of thinking. Um, so he describes examples of how physics changed subtly to match cultural philosophy over time, and how human perception results in discontinuities that relate to this idea of that suggest this idea of miracles and how man views himself in nature. And finally, he kind of talks about how atheism, this idea of trying to get away from religious thought, ultimately still leads you back to this religion of science that he talks about. So finally, Heidegger kind of argues about this idea that of technology being a means to bring about some end for human gain. However, he asks the question: will humanity ever truly master technology? So Heidegger writes from the perspective of the 1940s. World War II just ended. Humankind had just attempted to dominate nature using technology. Especially the Germans had attempted to dominate other races that they felt were below them, using this idea of racial superiority, which is kind of a variation of this idea of general superiority that we've seen. Um, so his argument is that the essence of technology is defined by the natural material that makes the technology, the real substance, the form of that the technology is made by human hands, the end to which the technology was dedicated to, and the means by which that technology was made. So there was a very interesting point that was made in this piece I'd like to bring up, which is the idea that material and form are intrinsic to technology. However, the intended end that the technology works for is only a beginning. It's not the end-all be-all of what that technology will ultimately be used for. That's something that was very, very evident in Heidegger's time. In the 1940s, we see technologies like nuclear weapons and aircraft being being used for dramatically more deadly reasons than what they had been invented for. And As a result of that, this kind of points towards how humans kind of use technology as a way to dominate nature. For example, um, Heidegger kind of provides this example of the construction of a hydroelectric dam over the Rhine River. So ultimately, he kind of argues that humankind doesn't really fully control nature using technology. This is obviously not in line with contemporary thought, especially with groups like the Germans and even to some extent the Allies, who kind of felt like they had begun to truly dominate the world with their incredible industrial and engineering technology. Um, so essentially, he argues that yes, whenever yes, humanity can develop magical technologies which are reliable and capable of doing wondrous, almost miraculous things. However, by approaching the universe only from a technological perspective, trying to generalize it down to mathematical formulas and equations, you can't completely understand the complexity of nature. And this is an idea that kind of is also mentioned in Spengler as well. Um, so there's a suggestion that by in framing everything in a mechanical way, you cannot perceive the ultimate truth of the universe, that there's a certain truth that is hidden from you. And the way that this is combated is through human reflection. So there are three primary ideas that I would like to talk about that are related to these pieces, the ways that these pieces are connected. So first, I feel as if all three of these pieces kind of talk about this idea of religion versus science. So every single piece agrees on the definition of science. Science is defined to be the reduction of universal truth into inframed generalizations, models like gravity and magnetism. The difference between these sources is how religion and nature are treated. So in Blumenberg, religion and wholly natural thought is treated as unrealistic. Um, Religion focuses only on ideas that make humans happy, that kind of cater to our tastes and our desires and our ideals. However, it does not fully take into account the harsh reality of physics and science. There's discontinuities that pop up between human theories about the reality of our world versus the ones that have been discovered by harsh scientific thought, like what was discussed, what was discovered by Francis Bacon. Spengler argues that science, in a way, is a religion all on its own. There is to some extent, rather than a harsh divide or unrealism to thinking in a way that is religious in a way. Scientific thinking is implicitly religious. He argues that there's not really a real way to divorce truly scientific objective thinking from human biases. Um, and Heidegger argues that technological thought is incomplete. Faith, non-scientific understandings of the world are required to get that last bit of extra truth that you can't truly understand through pure science. So these thoughts are mostly reflective of how many people thought of science and religion during the early 20th century. Because of the devastation of World War II, And this kind of demonstration of the superiority of technology through through the immense power of industrialism we see during the war, there's this feeling of atheism, this shift away from religion, um, that many people see happening. And then in other ways, we see a shift towards a spirituality or a faith to try and understand and describe the atrocities of what had happened during that war. And of course, that is not only World War II, but also World War One in the case of Spengler's writing. Um, so the next idea that's kind of discussed is the mastery of truth. So there's this question of whether or not truth will rise to the top. So there are two sources in this mind map that, in my opinion, overwhelmingly argue that the answer to that is no. Truth is not objective. Truth will not rise to the top. This is something. This is a thought process that was very important during the formation of the Western justice system. During the medieval age, justice was handed out impartially, was very swift, and resulted in very severe punishments. For example, in the United States, you would see the Harlem witch trials, where Salem witch trials, sorry, where women were sentenced summarily to death based off of very, very loose judicial arguments. This idea that there was no evidence that explicitly supported them. Well, there was anecdotal evidence of them being witches, and because no positive evidence had surfaced, that automatically meant they were guilty. Because of thoughts like these and this kind of philosophical thinking, we see the modern justice system that we have today, where whenever you enter a legal situation, you are assumed to be not guilty. You're assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. This kind of reflects this concept that truth will not automatically rise to the top, and instead, a individual or a team of individuals trying to figure out the truth have to interrogate the truth to discover the full extent of what is happening. And finally, I believe that these sources talk about the idea of culture's effect on science. And this is somewhat different to the effect of religion on science. Culture, which is how a specific society thinks about itself in the world, irrevocably impacts how science and technology are formed. Um, and perhaps that becomes more relevant when you think about the one of the most common topics in our class, artificial intelligence. Heidegger believed that a technology that was designed for a certain end um, would was only the end that a technology is designed for would only be the beginning of its use. For example, at the time of his writing, nuclear weapons were this kind of, well, aircraft were this kind of technology. Airplanes were designed as devices for transport or maybe some kind of light military use, but they ended up being the instruments of the death of millions of people through fire bombings and heavy daytime civilian strategic bombing raids all over Europe and Asia. And in addition, Spengler kind of talks about how technology and science come from this place of human bias. Again, as I mentioned, or alluded to somewhat with the National Socialist Germany from the 1920s and 30s. Spengler was also probably reflecting on the culture of sociology and human science that had cropped up during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This idea of social Darwinism, where it was felt that due to the technological progress and the advancement, quote unquote, of Western society, Western thinkers and Western cultures had a certain sense of dominance over the entire world. Um, so as a result of that cultural, that natural, that non-technical thought, technology and science evolved to try and justify those things. There were pseudosciences where people measured the cranium sizes and dimensions of the skulls of different races to demonstrate how different features caused low intelligence, high aggressiveness, and poor ability to develop and understand technology. and these are ways that Europe was able to justify how certain races were inferior to others. This is one of the major ways in where um, nationalism and racism were justified to the extent of creating nationalist socialist nations like Nazi Germany, Italy, Japan, and even a lot of the racist movements in the United States and in Europe, and anti-immigration movements all over the world. So this is definitely an idea that was very much based from the contemporary observations of Spengler and Heidegger. Um, and in general, I think that is one of the biggest observations that I've found throughout this entire mind map is there is a very, very strong link to the history that goes behind the times that these writers lived in. In general, many of these ideas were kind of the main topics that were being struggled through during that interwar World War II period. So ultimately, I believe that there is a certain direct reflection of how truth and science were being reconsidered in the face of massive global conflict during the First and Second World War. And in turn, we kind of see how we kind of see how those conflicts apply to us today. For example, this idea of religion versus science. I remember in class we had a lot of voracious discussion about that idea. In general, from my research, a source will be attached. And well, the source that I use will be attached to the mind map after I complete this video. I had found that in general, we've seen as a society, we've begun to shift more towards this objective scientific view of the universe. This is something that this is kind of edging more towards um, what Blumenberg is kind of stating that science exposes more of the universe than religion sometimes does. In my opinion, I think I ultimately think as a result of these thoughts and kind of where we are today, we very much are still living many of the debates that these authors have brought up. I still see a very significant debate between whether or not humans should whether or not humankind and culture should live more by a religious view where we have these cults of um, focusing on truth that encourages health and happiness versus an absolute mechanical scientific truth. And I think these are very, very important questions to consider whenever you start talking about artificial intelligence and other technologies like that. And with that, I believe that should be all that I have for today. Thank you so very much for watching, and have a good rest of your day.